This is the third of our Dr. Zhivago series. Part 1 compared Dr. Zhivago to Sound of Music. Part 2, I looked at Dr. Zhivago the novel, themes and characters. Part 3, we're going to look at the poems at the end of Dr. Zhivago. Many people who see the movie don't go on to read the novel. Some who read the novel don't linger with the poems. And the poems are a very, very important part of Dr. Zhivago because they give you a feel for the actually complex character of Dr. Zhivago himself, as he's trying to make sense of a very difficult temperament himself, and then the times he lives in. And so you've got these two things at work in Dr. Zhivago the novel, and then the main protagonist in the novel, Zhivago himself. His internal torrenness, his complex personality, and then the times he lives in, which are tragic, they're sad, they're violent, and the implications of that. Not an easy time to be alive in the least. There are 26 poems in the Dr. Zhivago cycle of poems, and the two bookends, the first is Hamlet, and the end one is Fairy Tale. I'm going to read you the first poem, Hamlet, because it gives you a sense of the major themes that are going to follow, and then I'll briefly touch on the final poem, Fairy Tales, and then linger with some of the poems in between. Let me start with Hamlet. The noise is stilled. I come out on the stage, leaning against the doorpost. I try to guess from the distant echo what is to happen in my lifetime. The darkness of night is aimed at me, along the sights of 1,000 opera glasses. Abba, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. I love your stubborn purpose. I consent to play my part. But now a different drama is being acted. For this once, let me be. Yet the order of the acts is planned, and the end of the way inescapable. I am alone. All drowns in the Pharisees' hypocrisy. To live your life is not as simple as to cross a field. You can see very, very much, first of all, in the poem Hamlet, he's drawing very strongly from obviously the Bible, Abba Father, if it's possible. He knows what he's going into, a terrible period of history. He would prefer not to go through that period of history. Who would? And if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, just as Jesus raised that question as he was in Gethsemane. And of course, one of the major poems in this cycle is Gethsemane itself. In one sense, it's very interesting what's going on. Zhivago, in some ways, is in Dr. Zhivago, in a subtler way, a Christ-like figure. And it's fascinating the way these themes and poems constantly interweave with biblical themes. And probably a quarter of the poems in the cycle are very, very much drawn from the life of Christ. And the Laura and Katya and Zhivago are almost seen as the Holy Family in some ways. And so there's fascinating interplay going on here. But the poem very, very much begins that life is, as Shakespeare would say, all the world is a stage and men and women merely players. We have our entrances, we have our exits, but we never know what our period of time of history is going to bring us. No one can predict that. And Zhivago in Hamlet is acutely aware that the moment he is entering into history is going to be a very difficult and trying one for his nation, for himself, for his family, for his future he'd hoped for. And all his hopes and expectations are likely to be dashed. They're not likely to be fulfilled. So how does one live, knowing that one's hopes are never likely to be fulfilled because of the tragic reality of the lived circumstances? And so this is very much Hamlet sets the stage. The last poem, which actually it's run in two cycles, is Fairy Tale. It's a very, very long poem. And most of us think of the fairy tale of the prince who heads out to do battle to save the princess. The dragon has coiled around the princess, and the prince comes as a valiant knight to save the fair maiden who has been captured by the dragon, who are a killer. The way this fairy tale usually is played out is usually positive. After the initial struggle of the fair maiden being stolen from the village, the town, the dragon takes them away. Arthur, the Galahad, comes marching out, saves the maiden, and as in many fairy tales, we live happily ever after. That's not going to be Pasternak's way, because he knows in the Russian Revolution, life is not a fairy tale with a happy ending. And so in the two cycles of the fairy tale itself, you have the knight, interestingly, not on a conscious quest particularly to save a fair maiden. He almost stumbles into it. He's riding with his horse seemingly to war, and he takes a bypath, and he sees from the cave smoke coming. He sees the maiden. And so we almost at times, Zhivagos, we're thrown into situations, we're presented with dilemmas and challenges. What do? We never anticipated them. Now, the way the fairy tale ends, actually both versions of it, is unlike the usual fairy tale where the knight rescues the maiden, the dragon is killed, and then people live happily ever after. What in fact happens, the knight falls off his horse, the horse kills the dragon, and what happens is you have this moment in which the knight and the maiden are briefly together and they both die fairly quick. So it's yes, they're brought together. It's not the knight doing the noble deed, it's someone else. It's not living happily ever after. They have a few moments together, and then life comes to an end. Very much, he's rewriting historic fairy tales in that sense by basically saying, you can have these ideas, these myths of what if you try and live the good life, good will emerge, victory will occur, but there are many situations, in fact, in life where that's not how that fairy tale myth works itself out in the real world. So let's have a more mature, a more in-depth read of how the world actually is, which doesn't mean you don't try and be the knight in circumstances, but recognizing it may not end well. It may not end well. And so just be aware that life is a blend of the comedic, where sometimes things do work out well, but in many situations, in fact, it's a tragic ending, and even the best intentions can lead to death and to suffering and this. So these bookends then, Hamlet at one end of the poetic cycle, in which, if possible, let the cup pass. But the cup isn't going to pass. You're going to go into the thick of the struggle, but there's no guarantee when you go into the thick of the struggle it's going to be a good ending. It's not going to be, but that doesn't mean you don't go into the struggle. It's just being aware that sometimes it's not going to end well, depending on the moment of history a person grows up in. Now, the cycle of the 26 poems are ones which begin, interestingly enough, in spring. So you have March. The snow is melting. The weather is getting warmer. The sky is blue. Resurrection is occurring. So you can see this, there's hope. The Zhivago poems begin, in fact, with a sign of hope and resurrection, and then they slowly begin to move through the cycle of spring, summer, autumn, and then they end with a couple of very vivid and graphic poems about Mary Magdalene, given how she has lived, what she's been through. At what sense is she a Laura figure? The story of Jesus in Gethsemane. What's that particular poem point to in terms of trying to do the right thing? And of course, what you've got in Dr. Zhivago is in the biblical story. In the biblical story, you have Jesus, of course, and of course there's a poem that deals with Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, and of course the violent forces under Herod that come in, but they escape to Egypt. Now, what's the story of Zhivago is very, very much you have violent forces. So this is just Herod, the Roman Empire, Pilate, as it were, coming to the Holy Family. Unlike, though, the story of the Gospels, where they flee to Egypt, they come back, and then Jesus is constantly confronted by forces that oppose him. There is the death, but there is the resurrection. This cycle of poems basically holds together. Yes, this is a story which holds our mythic attention, our attraction very much, but things don't always work out in a resurrection. Things don't always turn out well. So how do we hold together the comedic nature of the Gospels? Not comedy as in ha ha ha, but in you face the agon, the struggle, the opposition, you overcome it, and things work out well in time in history. But the tragic element of also when you're trying to live with some integrity, in fact, it doesn't work out. it doesn't work out well. So this cycle of 26 poems hold together in a very subtle, intricate, and refined way two worldviews, the comedic that you get in the Gospels and the tragic that often people can experience in life. And it's in that tension Boris Pasternak articulates a vision of what life is really like, not what we would like it to be, not what we would hope it would be, but when people are in the thick of the struggle, the likely conclusions can go different directions. Within these poems also, which I haven't discussed, and they also can be significant, are the Laura poems, because his relationship with Zhivago and Laura, there's tender moments again and again when they're alone, they're stranded at Tverikino, the place in Yuriatin, in which Zhivago is very, very much held. It's almost like a hermitage, a monastery, in which the intense pressure, they're almost put in an anvil. And he writes these very tender and telling and thoughtful poems about the relationship with Laura. There's also hints of poems to Tonya as well, because Zhivago is constantly torn between what he has done, feeling guilty about what he's done. Both women are gone. What has his life really been all about? It's a Hamlet, things. He, like Hamlet, knew what he had to do, and his father came to him and said, the man who's with your woman is the person who murdered your father. Act justly and respond. But Hamlet doesn't, and this is the same with Yuri Zhivago. Torn between 1,000 clashes between what's good, better, best, right, wrong, and this is reflected in his Hamlet poem and the poems on Laura themselves. So between the poems that deal again with the seasons of the year, the poems that are taken from the Bible, the echo between the poems taken from the Bible and Zhivago's life, and then the Laura poems, they sum up the 26 poems in Dr. Zhivago. And so in reading the novel Dr. Zhivago, it is very important, if possible, to linger for a few months on the 26 poems themselves, because they flesh out, they reinforce, they take one deeper into the layered content of the novel Dr. Zhivago itself. And so it endeth the lesson, part 3.